My mic's on now. Okay, so last week I told you that as we continued our sermon series about the fact that God has already won, that we were going to be digging into Revelation today. And as I was preparing that lesson from Revelation, I realized we really need to lay some more groundwork before we get to the book of Revelation. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be asking the question, when will these things happen? And we'll be working our way directly through Matthew 24 and 25. Now, that is a decent chunk of Scripture. And on top of that, we need to look at some things from the Old Testament. So as Bob already said, this is going to be a little bit of a long sermon. But I think it'll be worth it. Now, Matthew 24 is so very important because in it, Jesus speaks about his return. But he also speaks about some other things, specifically the destruction of Jerusalem. And there have been many people who have seen what Jesus says in Matthew 24. They don't understand the apocalyptic literature. They don't understand the Old Testament references. And so there are many false doctrines that have come about because of misunderstandings from Matthew 24. So before we even dig into Revelation, we need to understand what Jesus is talking about. And to do this, we need to go back and understand how the first century Christians would understand what Jesus says in Matthew 24. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a deep sermon, and so I encourage you that if you haven't picked up a note-taking outline on the back, go ahead and go get one. I'm not going to be offended if you get up right now and go get one, because then you can take your notes, you can see the passages, and you can study those things more when you get home. Okay, while some people are going to get that, let's jump in and let's look at the first part of Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3, in which we're going to see the lead-in and some questions. Matthew 24, starting in verse 1, and we read, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Those were some magnificent buildings. When you see artist renditions of what those would have looked like, it was absolutely amazing. So then Jesus says this really earth-shattering statement. He said to them, "Do you not see all these things?" Well, yeah, they pointed them out to you, Jesus. "Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Whoa. Jesus, that's a huge statement. Jesus just told them that the central aspect of their entire culture would be destroyed. You know, to us, we know the temple was destroyed. So to us, yeah, the temple will be destroyed, whatever. We don't have that very deep connection to the temple that they did. But for them, everything revolved around temple worship. There was the morning and the evening sacrifices every single day. Whenever they were to get married, they had to come and make a sacrifice. If there was a death, they came and made a sacrifice. If they made a covenant, they came and made a sacrifice. Every major life event revolved around the temple. The feast days and the festivals revolved around the temple. And so when he says that temple is going to be destroyed, and not just destroyed and rebuilt, but it's going to be leveled, not one stone on top of another, that's earth-shattering for them. And so as he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, okay, we have a time jump here. They had to leave the temple, go across that valley, up to the Mount of Olives. As he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they're concerned. They ask this question. And what we have here is really two questions that they think are one question. Let's break it down. That first question is, when will the temple be destroyed? When will these things happen? Okay, that's a great question. Second question, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus answers these questions as two separate questions. Now, to the disciples, well, they still thought Jesus would set up an earthly kingdom in Jerusalem. We still see that in Acts chapter 1, after he already had been resurrected and he was about to ascend to heaven. They're still thinking, okay, Jesus, when are you going to set up your earthly kingdom? When are you going to sit in Jerusalem as king on a throne? They're still thinking physical. So to their minds, the destruction of the temple must be tied with the end of the world. Because if Jesus is going to sit on a throne right now in their mind, then the temple being destroyed has got to mean the absolute end of the world. But they were mistaken. And so now we go into this discussion that Jesus gives about the destruction of Jerusalem. Verses 4 through 35 are all discussing the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's lay some groundwork. So remember, they asked those two questions that they thought were one, and Jesus is answering that first one. When will the temple be destroyed? Let's set the historical context. So historical context here that we know because we have the luxury of being 2,000 years later. The Romans believed that the Jews posed a threat of rebellion. And to be honest, some of them did. There were zealots and such that were very rebellious. The Roman general Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. Now, there's a lot of history, a lot of lead-up that came up to that. But for the sake of time, we're just going to look at that fact that the general Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And that temple in Jerusalem has never been rebuilt. It is no longer there. And in fact, that location, the Temple Mount, is greatly contested today. The Muslims claim it as their holy place, the Jews claim it as their holy place, the Catholics claim it as their holy place. But there's no temple in Jerusalem anymore. That's history. We know those things happened. We have the luxury of having been 2,000 years later. But now let's look at some key textual elements, because one of the questions that I get asked almost every time I have this conversation with somebody, when I first say, well, verses 4 through 35 are talking about the destruction of the temple, they say, well, how do you know? Well, we're getting there. We're going to discuss it. But let's answer that question up front. We have some key textual elements that we need to take note of. First off, verse 34, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So everything that happens up to that point in Jesus' discussion takes place during their lifetime. Now that gives us two options. Either all the things he talked about up to verse 34 happened in the first century, or there's some 2,000-year-old Jews wandering around somewhere. Those are our options. The other key textual element is the shift from those days to that day. Let's examine that just a little bit, because that might sound kind of nitpicky. But in the Greek, the wording does change from a plurality of days to a singular day. Verses 19, 22, and 29, Jesus talks about those days. Verse 19, "But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days." Plurality of days, more than one. Verse 22, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." So again, talking about a time span. And finally, verse 29, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the power of the heavens will be shaken." Again, those days. And we contrast that with verse 36, where Jesus says, "But of that day." Now it's singular. It's an event. "Of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." So those key textual elements show us that there is a shift from the first question to the second question. And we'll talk about that more as we work our way through this. So let's jump in and let's dig into what Jesus says about the destruction of Jerusalem. Verses 4 through 8, Jesus discusses the beginning of birth pangs. He says, "And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you." That's a key element of this. See to it that no one misleads you. "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you're not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs." Now, like I said, many people don't know the historical context of what Jesus is talking about here. And so they look at that, and then they say, wait, I'm seeing wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes. And they go, the world is ending. You've all heard that, right? We've all probably talked to people who are like, there's wars, more wars than I've ever heard of, and there's this famine and this earthquake. It's the end of the world. There have always been wars, famines, and earthquakes somewhere on earth. I challenge you to find a history book and find me a time frame where there weren't wars, rumors of wars, famines, and earthquakes. You can't do it. Throughout human history, there have always been wars, famines, and earthquakes. Jesus is saying these things are nothing special. Don't listen to false teachers. He says those things aren't the end. So when a false teacher comes and says, I'm the Christ, don't listen to them. Don't listen to what they're saying. Now, what's changed for us today is the internet. 200 years ago, the only wars you would hear about are the ones that are directly around you. Life may seem really peaceful, and you don't know that 100 miles that way there's a bunch of people dying because there's no internet. Now we have the internet, and every day we're bombarded by wars and rumors of wars and famines and plagues and earthquakes and everything's bad. Those things have always been happening. So now we move forward in our text, verses 9 through 14, and we see the lead up to the end. Jesus says, then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Again, people look at this and they say, I'm seeing that. There's persecution of Christians, and people are becoming more evil, and people's love is growing cold. And so they see those things and they say, the world is ending. Again, that's always happened. But let's give some historical context specifically about the people Jesus is talking to here. So Nero Claudius Caesar, we generally just shorten it to Nero, ruled Rome from the year AD 54 until his suicide in AD 68. Under Nero, Christians were heavily persecuted. Now, it did get worse under Domitian, but Nero was really the first of the Roman emperors to heavily persecute Christians. In fact, some historians believe that he blamed the burning of Rome on the Jews and the Christians. And so, in Acts 18, verse 2, we learn that the Jews were commanded to leave Rome. And so we see people who Paul interacted with who had to leave their homes in Rome because they were being expelled. We see this persecution taking place throughout the New Testament. We see the discussions of, okay, you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be hated, people are going to hate you because of the gospel. That was played out in front of us. We have most of the gospel books because people's love was growing cold and they were turning to evil and wickedness. They were buying into false teachings. And so the apostles would write and say, don't listen to that false doctrine. That's why we have most of our New Testament. Jesus makes the point here that things were going to get progressively worse. So again, don't listen to those false teachers. It's not the end. But then we get to a section that confuses some people. And that is the time to flee, verses 15 through 28. 15 through 28. And we pick up our reading, verse 15, where Jesus says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay. The people Jesus is talking to would have understood that reference immediately. They had studied, they knew their history, they knew their Old Testament, and so they would have immediately understood what he was saying. To be honest, most American Christians probably don't know what he's talking about. And so we see that, and our imaginations go wild. So, what is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel? Let's go back to Daniel and take a look at it. We're going to go first to Daniel 8, verses 9 through 14. You remember last week we discussed the rest of Daniel 8 and how where there is that vision of the ram and the goat. The ram had two horns, one that was longer than the other. And then the goat came, and the goat had one horn sticking out between its eyes. And it smashed into the ram, trampled the ram, and became great. Nothing could stand against it. But then, at the height of its power, that big horn was broken, and in its place came up four horns. And we discussed how that represented the ram was the Medes and the Persians, and then the goat was the Greeks, with their king Alexander the Great, and they came and they smashed the Medes and the Persians. And at the height of Alexander the Great's power, he died, and his four generals split up his kingdom, and they then proceeded to war against each other. That's the context of what we're talking about. Verse 9. One of them, out of one of them, that is out of one of the four horns that came up after that big horn was broken, out of one of them came forth a rather small horn. So a horn grew out of a horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host of the stars of heaven to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifices from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice, and will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifices apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Okay, there's a lot of symbolic language in there, and we're going to get to the meaning of this in just a second. I want us to look also at Daniel 11. Move forward just a few pages. And Daniel 11 foretells the wars of those Greek kingdoms. Remember, we had those four kingdoms, and the ones that really play a big role are the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And you see that for them to get to each other, they have to pass over Judea. This is one of the reasons why Judea is no longer the land of milk and honey, because it's been trampled by army after army till it was a desert. But the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they warred back and forth. And chapter 11 prophesies about that in such great detail that you can go through and read the histories, and it parallels chapter 11 beautifully. It's absolutely amazing. Verse 31, Daniel 11:31, we read this. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifices, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. There's that abomination of desolation, the phrase that we're looking for. This is the same thing that Daniel was talking about in Daniel 8, 9 through 14. So what is this talking about? Well, Antiochus Epiphanes, king of the Seleucid Empire, reigned from 175 BC until his death in 164. His name, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Epiphanes part was a title he took onto himself, literally meaning the vision of God. This dude called himself God. And what did Daniel 8 say? That he would elevate himself to the position of the Most High. He, at this time, ruled the area that is Judea. And to control the people in Judea, he appointed his own priest, high priest, and the proper high priest went into exile. You can read about this such stuff in the Maccabees. Well, he was down making war on the Ptolemies in Egypt, and he heard a rumor that Jerusalem was in rebellion. Whether that rumor was true, history doesn't record. But he goes up and he stops the regular sacrifice. He says, okay, you Jews aren't allowed to do your worship anymore. No more morning and evening sacrifices, which were central to the Jewish lifestyle. He then set up an idol to Zeus in the temple of God. And he sacrificed unclean animals on the altar of the temple, desecrating the temple, making it so they could not worship, so that the temple was unclean. The abomination of desolation. So, the Jews at Jesus' time, when he was speaking what is said in Matthew 24, they knew their history. They knew what happened. And so when he talks about the desolation, the abomination of desolation, they're thinking of these events that happened in their not too distant history. But what is the abomination of desolation that Jesus' followers were to look out for? Because after all, Antiochus Epiphanes had been dead for hundreds of years at this point, and the Greeks were no longer a kingdom. The Romans were controlling everything. Well, let's look at some parallels. So the Romans, they were descended from a Greek heritage. They had much the same organization and styles as the Greeks. They were a foreign power occupying Jerusalem. They had set up their own priests that would be loyal to them. They were, well, foreign invaders. And so what Jesus' followers needed to look out for was the Roman armies coming to stop the Jewish worship. That's what they were to look out for. And as we discussed, remember, General Titus came and destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. So what were the followers of Jesus supposed to do about those invading armies? Were they supposed to take up arms or make booby traps? Matthew 24, starting in 16 again. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in the house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. He says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner room, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So Jesus says, when you see those armies, flee to the mountains. Get out. Run. Don't go back to the house to pack up. If you're in the field, just split. Go. And don't believe false Christ. There's going to be people who come with false doctrine. Don't believe them. Okay. What about history? What does history record for us? Well, history records that Christians, when they saw Titus's armies, they fled to hiding places they had already prepared in the mountains. That they went, they saw Jesus' word, they understood what he was talking about, and they prepared hiding places with food and clothing so that when they saw those Roman armies, in fact, coming from 3 different directions towards the city of Jerusalem, they ran, they split. Now, some sources say there were no Christians killed when Jerusalem was destroyed. That's hard to substantiate because we don't know. But the fact of the matter is, Christians saw what was happening and they did flee. Then the text here gets apocalyptic. There's this section, verses 29 through 31, that Jesus uses apocalyptic language. And again, remember, the Jews of Jesus' time would understand the signs and symbols that he's using in that apocalyptic language. So we read, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Again, from an American standpoint, this sounds like Armageddon. This sounds like the absolute end of everything. But let's look at how the Jews of Jesus' time might have understood this. There is very similar language to this in many places in the Old Testament. Let's talk first about heavenly bodies being darkened. Let's go to Isaiah 13. We studied this some last week. Isaiah 13, verse 10. And to give context, let's start in verse 1, where we read, "The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw." So this is a prophecy about the destruction of Babylon. Verse 10, "For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light." Again, the darkening of heavenly bodies. Now, when Babylon was destroyed, the sun, moon, and stars didn't literally go out. But this language is communicating that for the people under that judgment at that time, their world was ending. The rest of the world wasn't ending, but their world was ending. Then let's go to Ezekiel 32. Ezekiel 32, verse 7. And Ezekiel 32, again, we'll look at verse 1 to set the context. "In the 12th year, in the 12th month, on the first of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lament over Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him." So this is a prophecy of the judgment of Egypt. Verse 7, And when I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken the stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights of the heaven I will darken over you, and I will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord God. Now this one's a little bit more specific. It talks about darkening of the heavenly bodies in that land. Now, when Egypt was judged, this is long after the Exodus, when Egypt was judged specifically by the Greeks coming to destroy, the sun, moon, and stars didn't literally go dark there. What this is referring to is those people under that judgment at that time, their world was ending. The rest of the world's not ending, but their world was ending. Now let's talk about the stars falling from the heavens. Again, people look at what Jesus said about the stars falling, and they'll try to start drawing correlations to satellites or something like that. Let's go to Isaiah 34. Isaiah 34, verse 4. And we read in Isaiah 34, verse 4, "And all the hosts of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts will also wither away as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom, and upon the people who I have devoted to destruction." This is an oracle about the destruction of Edom. Edom was a kingdom that was to the south and east of Judea. They were going to be judged. And when Edom was destroyed, when they were judged, the sky wasn't literally rolled up like a scroll. The stars and moon and sun did not literally wither away. But it's talking about, you're going to hear this a lot, the people at that time under that judgment, their world was ending. The rest of the world wasn't ending, theirs was. But then someone will say, but Jesus talks about the Lord coming in a cloud. Well, that imagery is also familiar from the Old Testament. Isaiah 19:1. Isaiah 19:1. And we read, "The oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them." Again, this is judgment on Egypt. And the Lord didn't literally ride a cloud to Egypt to judge them. This is Day of the Lord terminology, which we'll study some more in greater depth later on. But that terminology is that this judgment isn't just a random act. It's not just happening, oops. This is God specifically coming to judge those people. But he doesn't do it with his miraculous sword. He uses another nation on earth. He uses a generally pretty wicked group of people to come in and judge this other group of people. We see that throughout history. So now, when we come back forward to Matthew 24, and we look at the figures in this section, this is very much judgment terminology. Verses 29 through 31 of Matthew 24 refers to the judgment of Jerusalem for rejecting the Messiah. He is using terminology that they would understand as God coming in judgment. He's basically saying, guys, Jerusalem being destroyed isn't an accident. It's not like God lost the reins of the Romans and, oops, they're out of control. This is God using the Romans to judge wicked Jerusalem that rejected the Messiah, did not listen to his message, and were persecuting Christians. The next section, verses 32 through 35, we see that they would recognize the signs. We read, "Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door." Let's talk about that part I highlighted in red just for a second. Again, we think of that and we think, oh, Jesus is returning. Well, again, this is God coming in judgment. They would have understood God is coming to judge. So what he tells them here is that they would be able to see and recognize the signs that the temple will soon be destroyed. Pay attention, guys. You'll be able to see it. You'll be able to see that abomination of desolation. You'll be able to see the tribulation. So recognize the signs. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So as we discussed already, everything up to this point would come about within the lifespan of the people listening to him there. So we're left with two options. Either all of this happened in the first century, or there's some really old Jews somewhere in the world. And in fact, there are some religions who say that there are invisible apostles walking around right now, because they take this to mean that all these things are happening in our future. Again, reminding us of the history, Jesus spoke this in AD 33. 37 years later, the Roman general Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. 37 years later. That is well within the lifespan of the people sitting and listening to Jesus. In fact, the Apostle John lived until the mid-90s AD. So, this all, up to verse 35, is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But now Jesus shifts his focus, and he talks about the return of Christ. Matthew 24, 36 through 42. And remember, they asked those two questions that they thought were one question. When will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? See how he answers that question. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." So we see that shift in language. Those days, the destruction of Jerusalem, the time leading up to that was going to be a long time frame. But then that day and that hour, we're not even talking about a long day at a time. This moment, this event, he says no one knows. And you think about that. Not the angels, nor the Son, but only the Father. Only the Father knows when Jesus will return. Now, just for a second, I want us to pause and think honestly to ourselves. How arrogant would it be of me to say, well, Jesus doesn't know he's going to come, and the angels don't know, but I do. I've put the code together. How arrogant would that be of me to say that? Jesus says, only the Father knows. Goes on, he says, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah." So he's going to refer back to Genesis 6, where the world was so wicked, so evil, that God said, I'm going to destroy everything and start anew with Noah and his family. It says, for as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. They were just going about their daily lives. It says, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man be. So those people before the flood, they were living their life. You don't plan a marriage unless you're planning on a future. They were planning on life just continuing. And it's going to be the same way when Jesus returns. People will be living their lives. They're going to get jobs. They're going to go to work that day. They're going to get married. They're going to make plans for the future. And boom, it'll happen. People will be going about their everyday lives when Jesus returns. It's not going to be some post-apocalyptic hellscape where there's been years and years of this, that, and the other happening and everybody is in an uproar. It's going to be just an everyday kind of day. It says, then there will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left. Now some people have looked at this and thought, okay, well, rapture and there'll be people working and the one will be taken, but then there's going to be like 10 years until the other person. That's not really what this is talking about. What this is talking about is that some will be ready and others will not be ready. And the point being, are you ready? When he comes, are you going to be taken to paradise or are you going to be sent to destruction? Are you ready? Then notice what he says. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. That's intense right there. Be on the alert, for you do not know. So, since we don't know when he'll return, we must live in a state of readiness. And the message being, are you ready? And you think about human nature. What do? We procrastinate. Okay, you may not procrastinate. I'll grant you may be so on the ball that you don't procrastinate. But think about the rest of us normal people. What do? Do we write our paper the minute we get the assignment? Or the week or the day before it's due? Okay, maybe you wrote your stuff early. When we know that mom and dad are coming home after we've had a party, do we just avoid the party in the first place? Or are we still cleaning up the mess as they're walking in the door? We procrastinate, right? We're humans. So if Jesus said, okay, here is step 1 that heralds my return will be in 10 years. Here's step 2 that heralds my return will be in 5 years. Here's step 3 that heralds my return will be in a year. Here's step 4 that heralds my return will be in a week. What would we do? We would blow it off. Hey, I can live however I want. Okay, there's sign 1. I still got 10 years, man. Sign 2. I still got 5 years. Party on! I've still got 1 year. Woo! Living large. Okay, now a week away. Now I'll clean up my act. Right? Is that what Jesus wants? Does Jesus want generation after generation of last-minute obedience? No. He wants us to live faithful to him. And the vast message of the entire New Testament is live the way Christ wants you to live, day in and day out, from now until you die. That's New Testament Christianity for you. Are you ready? Jesus then gives 4 parables about being ready. And unfortunately, because of time, we don't have time to go through these in great depth. So we're going to go through them in overview style, and I encourage you, dig into these on your own time. The first one is the parable of the strong man and the robber, Matthew 24, 43 through 44. Jesus talks about a strong man, and if he knows when the robber is going to break in, he's going to be ready, right? He's going to be standing there with a club. But since you don't know when the robber's going to come, you lock your doors and windows, right? You prepare. The point is, be ready. Why? Verse 44, for this reason you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. That right there kind of tosses out the whole signs that he's coming. You don't know when he's coming. There won't be any signs. Okay, the next parable. the parable of the faithful and unfaithful servant. And in this parable, verses 45 through 51, there's one servant who, when his master goes on a trip, he continues doing his work, he's doing everything he's supposed to do, and when the master comes and finds him working, he praises that good servant. But the unfaithful servant, as soon as the master leaves, starts beating his fellow slaves and drinking and partying and doing all sorts of other stuff. And when the master returns unexpectedly and finds him doing all these wicked things, that particular servant is punished. And the point is, be obedient. Keep doing your work even when you don't know when he's going to come back. Then in Matthew 25, 1 through 13, we have the parable of the 10 virgins. In this, there were 10 virgins who were going to go to the marriage feast. 5 of them brought extra oil, so that when they'd all kind of fallen asleep waiting for the bridegroom comes, they could fill up their lamps and go with the bridal party. But the 5 that did not bring extra oil, they had to go try to find some, and they were left outside of the marriage feast. So the point is, be prepared. You don't know when he's going to return. And the 4th parable is the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, 14 through 29, in which 3 servants are given different amounts of money and the master goes on a trip. The first 2 used that money, invested it, made business decisions, and gave their master back more money than they were given. The other one, the 3rd one, buried his talents, and then when the master returned, came and gave that 1 talent back. And the master was upset, said, you should have just at least put it in the bank, then I could get interest. The point there being, be wise with your time. You don't know how much time you're going to have. You don't know when he's going to return or when you're going to die, so use your time wisely. Then Jesus wraps up this speaking section with the final judgment. Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And in this, it talks about how he separates those who are righteous and those who are unrighteous like sheep and goats. And to the group that is righteous, he says, you get to go and get your reward because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink, etc. And they say, when did we do this? He says, well, when you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. And then he looks to the other group and he says, you didn't do these things. You didn't feed me when I was hungry, etc. And they say, when did we not do these things? He says, well, when you did not do it to the least of my brethren, you didn't do it to me. The point here that Jesus is making is the reward is for those who live in readiness by living in obedience to Christ's word. Living their lives day in and day out, doing what he said. Those are the ones that he's going to reward. So in this overall message, the point that Jesus is getting across is, you don't know when the end of the world is going to come. So live your life as faithful as you can, day in and day out, because you don't know when it's going to be over. So today, long sermon, but we've been talking about this question, when will these things happen? Matthew 24 and 25. And we've seen that Jesus asked those 2 questions that the disciples thought were one. When will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your return? And he told them there were going to be signs they'd be able to recognize about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and to be ready, and when they saw those things, flee the mountains. But then he talked about his return, that no one knows the day or the hour. And so be ready, because it could end at any time. So what's the message for us? What do we take away from this? Well, our challenge is this, that we need to live each day as if Christ were coming that day, because he very well might be. And even if it's not his final return, you and I may not survive past the day. We might walk out there and get in a car accident. You don't know when the end is coming, for the world or for you. So we each need to live our lives ready for when he returns, so that when we do meet our master, he'll look at us and say, well done, my good and faithful servant. So today, as we are going into our invitation, if you're a Christian, you've been listening to this and you realize that maybe you haven't been living your life in readiness. Maybe you've been allowing yourself to indulge in sin or to follow false doctrine in some way, and you want to make your life right. I encourage you to come up to the front row and one of our elders come speak with you. And if you are listening and you realize that you need to put on Christ in baptism, or you need to learn more about what it means to become a Christian, because you want to be ready for that day, I encourage you, if you're watching on the live stream, to contact us, phone call, email, Facebook message, whatever. We'd love to teach you. We'd love to help you. And if you're here in the room with us, please come up to the front row as we are led in this invitation song.